The breaking news this morning, President Trump is threatening the man he just fired, the former FBI Director James Comey. He wrote this morning on Twitter, James Comey better hope that there are no tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press. Join me now, Steve Moore, CNN law enforcement contributor, retired supervisory special agent for the FBI. Matt Lewis, CNN political commentator, senior columnist for the Daily Beast, and Pate, CNN legal analyst and constitutional attorney. Paige, I can't believe I have to ask this, but I think we need to just make this clear before we move on. You know, they don't tape things at the White House anymore, where the president had dinner with the former FBI director, correct? And their conversations could not have been recorded either. Is that right?
John, I'm almost certain those conversations weren't recorded. Generally, you need to have the permission of both people who are involved in the conversation, a consent to record it. If you're going to record it and preserve it, the other person needs to know they're being recorded. What I think is happening here is that Donald Trump knows very well that there are no tapes to that conversation. And even more importantly, I think he intends to try to insist on executive privilege to keep Jim Comey from telling his side of the story. So it puts Jim Comey in a very difficult position. He may want to come clean. He may want to say, look, I want to tell you exactly what the president and I discussed, but I can't. It's the same thing Sally Yates went through before she testified. She went to the White House and said, can I go ahead and discuss this? And they let her do it. But they could assert executive privilege here, leading us to a really big problem because we won't be able to hear Comey's side of the story.
Would there be a compelling legal argument for executive privilege in this case, Paige?
He could try. And Comey, being who Comey is going to want to follow the law. I mean, that's the one thing that I've always said about Jim Comey. He is not as concerned about the political ramifications as he is following the law. He is a true Boy Scout. And if he thinks that executive privilege prevents him from responding directly to the president, then I don't think he's going to respond unless he's required or compelled to by a judicial subpoena.
Though I will say that some critics of James Comey say that James Comey also cares a lot about James Comey, and if he feels like that his honor is being impinged here, he might desire to go forward with that. Stephen Moore, aside from that point, when you have the President of the United States threatening the man who was just fired as FBI director, a man that the acting FBI director just said yesterday still engenders considerable loyalty within the ranks of the FBI, what does that do to morale within the FBI today? If you're an FBI agent, if you're an investigator on the Russia case, on anything, what are you supposed to think today?
Well, you know, in professional football, there's a thing called bulletin board material where the team that you're about to play says trash talks you, and they put it on the bulletin board to motivate the team to go out and beat the team that's talking about you. This is bulletin board material for the FBI. There is very few people threaten FBI agents or FBI directors because there's just no money in it. It's not going to work out for him.
Matt Lewis, I read everything you say on TV and Twitter with extraordinary precision, and I get the sense that you thought, at least in a way, as of last night, the White House and the president had maybe turned the corner a little bit on this, that the worst of the storm was over, and they started to give some explanations that were plausible here in terms of why James Comey was fired. But now this morning, with this tirade, what does that do not just to the messaging, but to the credibility of the president in the White House here?
Yeah, Donald Trump doesn't seem, even when he's doing well, you know, the other week we had, you know, he was on a roll. He had finally passed health care in the House. You had, he obviously had Neil Gorsuch appointed and confirmed to the Supreme Court. You could have made an argument at the 100-day mark. In fact, I did, that Trump had done much better than he was getting credit for. And then he does this. It seems like he will grasp defeat from the jaws of victory. He has to have drama. He can't let well enough alone, and he can't remain quiet. I think that this is a guy who in many ways is childlike. I think that it's entirely possible that this story is not as nefarious as people think in terms of the Russia angle. It could simply be that Donald Trump has a fragile ego, demands absolute loyalty, and has no impulse control. And frankly, you could argue that's more dangerous in a president than the notion that they were coordinating with the Russians in advance of the election.
If it is dangerous in either case, Matt, is it dangerous enough that Republicans on Capitol Hill will step in and say enough? Do they feel like it's time to say enough?
Well, I think that there's going to be, that is a process, obviously. Republicans have there's a benefit to having a Republican president who appoints Supreme Court justices like Neil Gorsuch, and who in some cases does act appropriately, right? So, for example, what they did in Syria, a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans applauded that decisive action. So there's a hesitation to drop this guy completely, to wash your hands of him completely. But I do think that every time he does this, it's harder and harder to defend the indefensible. If you look at the senators coming out against him, people like Jeff Flake and Ben Sasse and John McCain, it's not a good sign for a president that already has a lot of problems when you have members of his own party distancing themselves. And I think there's a Trump fatigue that is taking place, certainly.
Steve Moore, to you, at issue here is this dinner that happened January 27th between the president and the FBI director. The president claims he asked James Comey, is he under investigation? He claims that James Comey said no. People close to James Comey are now saying that Comey was asked for loyalty to the president. He would not guarantee that. Without being at that dinner, as none of us were, whose version of it do you find more credible at this point?
Well, I find it incredible that anybody would, a sitting president would ask the FBI director if he was under investigation, but I believe it happened. There is, you can say to the president, you're not under investigation, but that doesn't mean that you're not investigating the Russians and his name hasn't come up. You can honestly look at him and say, well, you're not under investigation, but that doesn't mean your name's not all through the files. I still think James Comey probably wouldn't have answered that question. I wouldn't have answered that question. It's not in the FBI culture to say yes or no, you are or are not under investigation.
And Paige, there are questions of legality. Was a law broken? Was it, by the letter of the law, obstruction of justice to ask that question if it was asked? And if the answer to that is no, then, does it violate a norm that might be just as important?
Well, John, I certainly think it violates all sorts of different norms about how you govern yourself as the chief executive of our country, but I don't think we've actually heard enough to conclude that it violates the federal law against obstruction. There are different types of obstruction, but without going through all the different legal hoops, the bottom line is you have to show that the president corruptly influenced either a witness or an official proceeding. And that's just difficult to prove with the facts that we have. Now, if we find out what actually was said in that meeting, perhaps we can get closer to an actual crime.
Yeah, but we don't think there are any tapes, despite what the president mused about this morning on Twitter. Steve Moore, Matt Lewis, Paige Pate, great to have you with us this morning, guys. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks.